Welcome to another edition of Fun Facts and History. Today, we will be discussing the American Revolution. The conflict between Britain and 13 of its colonies on the Atlantic coast of North America is known as the American Revolutionary War. During the American Revolution, 13 colonies declared their independence from Britain and concluded an alliance with France. As a result of the victory in the fighting that followed, the United States became an independent nation. With the Declaration of Independence, the 13 colonies became the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Now, it is time for our first fun fact of the day. Did you know that there was a plot to kill George Washington, the future first president of the United States? Several prominent politicians, including the governor of New York, planned a coup to kill the future first president. However, the plot was discovered by a secret committee set up by George Washington, but only Thomas Hickey, his bodyguard, who was also supposed to pull the trigger, was executed for this plot. The cost of the French and Indian Wars caused the British government to impose new taxes on its American colonies. Great Britain had amassed an enormous debt following the French and Indian War, so they imposed new tariffs and taxes on the American colonies to shoulder their burden. This did not go down well with the colonists, who believed that Anglo-American cooperation and shared sacrifice had achieved the victory in the war and were outraged at being forced to pay more. In 1763, Great Britain instituted parliamentary acts known as the Stamp Act to tax the American colonies. They enacted this to increase revenues to meet the costs of defending the enlarged British Empire. It was the first British parliamentary attempt to raise revenue through direct taxation on various colonial transactions. Enraged colonists nullified the Stamp Act by outright refusal. Following the lead of Patrick Henry and the Virginia House of Burgesses, they denounced the tax as unconstitutional and asserted that their own elected representatives could only tax them. Through the colonial assemblies, the American Congress, which met in New York in October 1765, demanded a repeal of the Stamp Act. Associations then emerged to enforce a general boycott of British goods. The economic retaliation proved more effective than petitions against the British. As British merchants and manufacturers began to suffer through the boycott, they joined the Americans in opposition to the tax. In March of 1766, a new ministry headed by the Marquis of Rockingham repealed the Stamp Act, and simultaneously, the British Parliament rejected the American principle of taxation without representation. The Stamp Act was repealed, and the colonists resumed purchasing British goods. After 1766, the British Parliament searched for new ways to assert its authority over the American colonies through the Townshend Act. The British Parliament passed these acts to assert what was considered a historical right to exert authority over the colonies by suspending a recalcitrant representative assembly, and strict provisions were made for collecting revenue duties. These acts were resisted in the American colonies with verbal agitation, physical violence, deliberate evasion of duties, renewed non-importation agreements among merchants, and overt acts of hostility toward British enforcement agents, especially in Boston. In response to the uprising, in October of 1768, the British Parliament dispatched 2 army regiments to Boston. These regiments' arrival and actions eventually led to the Boston Massacre. On the 5th of March 1770, the Boston Massacre, which started as a street brawl between American colonists and a lone British soldier, rapidly escalated into a chaotic, bloody slaughter. The conflict energized anti-British sentiment and paved the way for the American Revolution. It further incensed colonists who were weary of British rule and unfair taxation and roused them to fight for independence. Now it's time for our second fun fact of the day. Did you know that many women contributed to the Revolutionary War effort by acting as spies on behalf of the Patriots? One woman even went as far as serving in the Revolutionary Army with other men by disguising herself as a man. Her name was Deborah Sampson. This went on for about 2 years until she fell very ill and woke up in the hospital. Sampson was honorably discharged and even went on to get her full military pension. In 1773, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act. This act granted the East Indian Company the right to ship its tea directly to the colonies without first landing it in England. This was so because the company played an integral role in Britain's imperial economy, and also commissioned agents who would have the sole right to sell tea in the colonies. This act came with a heavy tax that made tea expensive. The Boston Tea Party was a political protest that occurred on the 16th of December 1773 at Griffin Wharf in Boston, Massachusetts. American colonists, frustrated and angry at Britain for imposing taxation without representation, dumped 342 chests of tea imported by the British East India Company into the harbour. This action, led by the Sons of Liberty, resulted in the British government imposing some intolerable acts. In retaliation for colonial resistance to British rule from the winter of 1773 to 74, the British Parliament enacted 4 measures known as the Intolerable, or Coercive, Acts. These included the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act, and the Quartering Act. Rather than intimidating Massachusetts and isolating it from the other colonies, the oppressive acts became the justification for convening the First Continental Congress in 1774 by the Americans. First Continental Congress. In order to enforce the new acts by the British Parliament on the American colonies, General Gage was sent to Massachusetts as the new military governor. However, Massachusetts refused to yield, and the other American colonies rallied to support the Bostonians. While Gage was gathering his troops in Boston and requesting instructions from London, colonial committees of correspondence decided to convene a Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September of 1774. Meanwhile, extralegal conventions began to replace the royal government and assume political control in the colonies. Delegates from all the colonies except Georgia attended the First Continental Congress, which started from the 5th of September to the 26th of October 1774. Redress of grievances, not independence, was acknowledged as the objective of the convention. However, militant leaders such as Samuel Adams, John Adams of Massachusetts, and Richard Henry Lee of Virginia led the Congress to reject a plan for conciliation offered by Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania. Instead, Congress demanded a repeal of all objectionable laws passed since 1763. It also allowed a Continental Association to enforce a new boycott of British goods. Provision was made for another meeting by May 1775 if England did not meet the demands. It is time for another fun fact. Did you know that some British soldiers moonlighted as actors in the American colonies? When the British held New York City, some soldiers spent the night acting in Broadway shows. Many of their plays had pro-British sentiments and prologues. The battles of Lexington and Concord, on the night of April 18, 1775, Paul Revere rode from Charlestown to Lexington, both in Massachusetts, to warn that the British were marching from Boston to seize the colonial armory at Concord. En route, the British force of 700 men was met on Lexington Green by 77 local Minutemen and others. It is unclear who fired the first shot, but it sparked a skirmish that killed 8 Americans. Hundreds of militiamen from the colonies also confronted the British soldiers at Concord. The British column had to retire to Boston because they were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. American snipers used this opportunity to take out many British targets. Total losses in the battles of Lexington and Concord numbered 273 British and more than 90 Americans. 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill was part of the American siege of British-held Boston. Some 2,300 British troops eventually cleared the hill of the entrenched Americans, but at the cost of more than 40% of the assault force. The battle was a moral victory for the Americans. When news of the fighting in Massachusetts reached the Second Continental Congress at Philadelphia, delegates assumed responsibility for the New England militia, and a Continental Army was designated. George Washington, a veteran of the French and Indian Wars from Virginia, was appointed the commander. The delegates wanted a European-style regular army to conduct a civilized war. George Washington, therefore, prepared his army though inexperienced, unlike the British military. The last thing Washington wanted was for the guerrilla warfare of the past to continue. Washington found that the patriots who were recovering from the fierce fighting at Bunker Hill had suffered from sectional dissensions and personal jealousy in their ranks. During the later part of the year, Washington and his staff labored to create a well-regulated army while the British army remained on the defensive. The American commander contemplated an assault on the British lines but wisely delayed action until Congress authorized him to bombard Boston. Time for another fun fact. Did you know 200 original copies of the Declaration of Independence were made? However, only one copy was signed by all 56 members of the Second Continental Congress, the copy still seen at the National Archives today. Of the 199 copies with the names of John Hancock and Charles Thompson, Secretary of the Congress at that time, only 26 are around today. The rest are lost in history. War for independence between Washington and the British generals. General William Howe moved his base of operations to New York to regain the upper hand against Washington. He reasoned that if he thrashed the rebel army, most Americans would return to the imperial fold as widespread enthusiasm waned. Congress would become willing to make peace. Howe wanted negotiation more than an outright victory because he was not only commander-in-chief but, with his brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, peace commissioner in America. This role handicapped him as a military leader and diplomat, yet events of the summer and fall of 1776 suggested that he would succeed. Meanwhile, the fervor of 1775 faded as General Washington tried to transform the Continentals into a regular army capable of holding New York against General Howe. He had less than 20,000 troops on Long Island, Manhattan, and the lower Hudson on the 25th of June 1776 when Howe landed at Staten Island. Howe tried first to negotiate but found that congressional representatives Benjamin Franklin and John Adams would settle for nothing less than independence. Howe then used his 32,000 troops, his brother's fleet, and 10,000 sailors to drive Washington off Long Island. Following him to Manhattan in mid-September, Howe attacked again in October, compelling Washington to withdraw to White Plains. In November, Howe captured the critical posts of Fort Washington, New York, and Fort Lee, New Jersey. Washington retreated across New Jersey with a disintegrating army. He crossed Delaware on the 7th of December with perhaps 5,000 troops fit for duty, with most of their enlistments expiring on the 31st of December. General Howe's strategy seemed to have worked brilliantly. The Continental Army was collapsing. Colonists in New York and New Jersey were eagerly swearing allegiance to the king, provisioning his forces, and enlisting in loyalist units. Howe saw widespread support for the revolution evaporating and assumed that Congress would soon negotiate. However, two features of his campaign were about to produce the opposite effect. First, Howe's troops, particularly the Hessians and the Loyalist irregulars, had handled civilian populations roughly. Every incident of rape and theft helped to crystallize widespread opposition to the British Army and occupation. Second, on the 13th of December, Howe sent his men into winter quarters, scattering them across central New Jersey in small cantonments, thus exposing them to attack. In a last-ditch effort to gain some victory and boost morale, Washington used what was left of his army to attack enemy units at Trenton in late December 1776 and Princeton in January 1777 and thus began restoring Continental morale. Howe, realizing the mistake of dispersing his men into smaller units, reconcentrated them in the lower Raritan Valley. This enabled the Patriot militia to regain control of the province and nullify Howe's recent successes. However, Howe did not yet see how counterproductive his approach had been by reconcentrating his army. His main focus was pursuing George Washington through Pennsylvania in 1777. This is a good time for our final fun fact of this episode of Fun Facts and History. Did you know that invisible ink was used to communicate top-secret messages during the Revolutionary War? Dr. James Jay, brother of the founding father, John Jay, created an invisible ink, made of ferrous sulfate and water that could be used to write secret messages and dry completely clear. One would have to hold the paper to heat or douse it with a revealing chemical to see the invisible messages. George Washington and his men made great use of the invisible ink to communicate. This brings us to the end of the first part of this edition of the American Revolution. Please like, share, subscribe and comment on our video. It would greatly help us boost our channel with the YouTube algorithm. Also, watch out for the second part of this edition. We will be uploading that shortly. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.